Welcome back everybody, and today it's Scarabs. Seems like everyone seems to give them the generic paint job, and as I'm starting out in this hobby and haven't really painted them before, and I'm not really keen on just doing the paint by numbers trick that everyone seems to do of whack on canaptic alloy and a couple of other colours and a bit of green and you're done. I thought I'd give it a little bit of a play around and stick with the Grimdark theme that I have been experimenting with. And from the outset, when I started this hobby a few months back, I committed to purchasing some of the Army Painter paints because they came in a good set, and I also got some inks, and today I'm going to be primarily using those inks. And there's not a huge selection in terms of color, so it's a matter of just using what you've got and mixing and matching. So you don't necessarily need a huge selection to get the job done at the end of the day. So that's what we're going to be playing with here as we endeavor to get a reasonable result out of these guys. And it's just a matter of trial and error, sucking it up and hoping for the best in some instances, because some of the applications that I'm trying I've never done before. So it's a matter of, is this going to work? Is it going to muck it up? No idea. So we'll certainly give it a red hot go. So I started by undercoating in black, and I did give them a dusting in a sort of the metal primer from Stynylrez, thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to paint them in the traditional way, before I came up with the idea of let's do something totally different. And as a result, then I decided, well, look, I need to actually paint the carapace or the wings or whatever that happens to be, body part, more black as a sort of a base for putting the rest of the color on. And so we did that, leaving the legs to have a slight bit of metallic. And the idea was to try and produce some form of grimy texture pattern on the body, like beetles, because they look like beetles, and you can either get stripes or spots. And the idea was, okay, well, let's try and create some form of texture or fabric that they've got that's visible. And the best way to do that was to apply in sort of brush strokes a combination of colors which I'd chosen, which was a brown and a green, to try and get a sort of murky looking color, because we're going for the Grimdark theme and we don't want it to be too vibrant. And it took several applications of that process to come up with a color that or a density of color that was sort of thick enough that gave the appearance. Now, what I learnt from some of my other examples of painting was that don't put it on raw straight, definitely dilute it down. It's a lot better when it's thinner, and if you stuff up, it really doesn't show. Yes, it takes a few more applications to get the full texture to finish, but it's a bit more satisfying. Plus also it's giving you practice and applying the paint, which isn't a bad thing when you're only just starting out. So that's a great idea. Now, the legs were a little bit too shiny, and so I used a bit of Payne's Grey over them just to dull them down, give them a bit more of a matte finish and mute the metallics, because we didn't want to look at that. And then progressively, as we worked up on the color on the bodies, we need to start changing the coloration slightly, and we also need to use more transparent layers to blend the gradients together, so that we don't have sort of extreme transitions. So it's just a matter of playing with your mixtures and slowly but surely lightening it off and blending over the top. And then it was a case of introducing some grey into the mix to start toning it down even further. And so the grey was mixed with the green and brown to try and sort of lighten it off a little, so that we've got a dark underbody and then the light sort of coming to the surface. And we started also mixing up the application. So instead of just doing the stripes, which we had, it was try and create other sort of finer textures by spotting the paint on. And that creates a sort of a blotchy effect, which is great because you just don't want homogeneous uniform paint, because it looks a bit sad. So definitely for the Grimdark theme, that seemed to work quite well. And then getting towards the end, it was a matter of putting then a glaze over the top of virtually the straight grey, very, very thin, to again sort of act as a transparent blending layer to even out some of the transition so it doesn't look so harsh. and it's just a matter of putting that on very wet and seeing what sort of result you get. Now, in terms of thinking how I was going to paint this, everyone seems to do them in a similar sort of fashion, and I thought, well, I want to be a little bit different and try a few little methods as well as I go along. And so I got that sap green that I was using in the ink and decided, well, I'm going to paint the spheres, orbs, whatever that central node is in the body, and also the back panel, because that's sort of looking into the internals of the creature. And so we put a little bit of that on, and that was again diluted, but not so much, because we want it to show. When you're putting any color too diluted over black, it takes a fair while to build up. Now, to create more of the grimy look for the body as well, there are elements around the legs, the mechanisms, those sort of little ball joints that are there, and I tried mixing brown and orange in the ink to create a sort of a dirty brown effect to try and cover them, but with the metallic showing through, it did have a more sort of metallic-y gold look, or a brassy look, so it took a couple of applications again to try and tone that down. But this is experience, obviously. Clearly you'd start with a different sort of approach and maybe not put the metallics on at all and just apply them where you want them as a finishing touch, but this is how you learn. And the next stage was to try and bring in the sort of the chipping to make it look like they're fatigued, they've had a bit of battle damage, that sort of thing. And it was mixing up some browns to try and get a sort of a muted dark sort of coloration, and applying that around the edges of the panels and across in little pieces, so to try and sort of pretend to have battle damage, that sort of thing on there. And we did have a couple of goes trying to play with the green, because I don't have the Tesseract green from the Citadel range, and I do have a fluoro green in the Army Painter, and I tried putting that on around the eyes. Now, in hindsight, it's probably better if you highlight the central lens first, because I only had to go back in and do that later, which you'll see. Now, the idea with the orbs was, instead of just painting them a solid color that they glow as part of an energy source, I'd seen a video where they had been turned into orbs, so kind of like a jewel, a gem, and there is a sort of a method that you can use to try and emulate light shining through a glassy object. And so I started with the sap green again, and then went up to I think it's Orc in the sort of the Speed Painter range, and mix the two together, progressively getting lighter and lighter, trying to apply a lens-like application of paint onto the front, so that there's sort of a light source being emulated. You be the judge on how effective it is. It certainly doesn't look as good as I've seen, but then fat brushes, poor application, all of the above. But the idea was to try and get that appearance rather than just have a big lump of green in the middle of the back. And systematically the idea is to go lighter and lighter, and ultimately then introduce some yellow into the mix to try and brighten it up to give that sort of focal point. And I did have a couple of goes at that, and made a bit of a mess a few times, and then found that the best application was to put the yellow on and then put a glaze of yellow over the top to blend it out, because I put too much on to begin with, didn't have a good enough transition. So again, learning curve. I also decided to put some of that fluoro green into the grooves on the back, because that's kind of like between the wings if they do open up, and you can see that. And it was a case of putting on a couple of coats and increasing the intensity of the bright green in the second coat by putting it closer towards the source, which is the middle of the body, just to try and provide some form of gradient that you would see. And the idea there is to try and sort of make it look like it's glowing from the inside without getting too crazy. Now we're back onto the eyes again. You can see that by placing the white, it gives you a brighter sort of undertone to the color when you put it over the top. So it's just flooding that eye recess with the green. and it actually took again a couple of applications because it was watered down. I didn't want to put it on solid, otherwise it would just cover over the white completely, but we want to make it look like they're somewhat glowing. And then finishing off the orbs, just blending it through so that it doesn't look so stark. And then there's a little specular highlight that you can put on at the back end, and it's probably a bit random in terms of the size that I applied with the fat brush, but it sort of gives the impression. You've got to start somewhere, I guess. So this looked half reasonable. I did notice that even though I was using a white ink, it did tend to sort of pool around the edges and go dark in the middle, so I had to apply it a couple of times to sort of dissipate that appearance. And looking at the little guys, I thought clearly they could probably do with a little bit more chipping. They didn't look battle damaged enough, and so out with the sponge. And the trick that I used here was I had the black on the wet palette, but I let it dry out so that it was really just a film rather than a wet paint, and then dabbed a sponge in it so that I didn't saturate the sponge and then have to dab it off all day. And that way you just got a small amount being applied, which at the scale of these guys was more than sufficient. And then back to the legs. This time what we're trying to do is reintroduce the metallics, but as damage rather than universally over the entire part of the organism. And so it was just edge highlighting, and also on the spheres around the tips of the feet, if you want to call them that, to try and make them a little bit more sort of worn. And lucky last was going back to the browns, and this time creating an exceptionally thin sort of color that we want to use as a wash over the entire model to dull it down even further, to bring in that more grim dark appearance. And so that was sort of pushed around the body, and with any application of paint, it tends to be where you take the brush off is where it concentrates. So using strokes down towards the bottom of the body to sort of concentrate the coloration towards the edges and the base is the idea that I tried to do. And also obviously around the heads, just little dabs here and there to give them all the same sort of tone. And that is sort of roughly where we got them to. Then just place them onto a base, and voila, we have a finished product. And I'm kind of happy with the way they turned out. They do look grim and dark. Clearly there's room for improvement, there always is, but so much better, I think, than just the standard basic Necron that has that sort of metallic finish. They sort of have a nice gritty appearance. They all look uniform enough. So this was obviously an exercise in trialing the process, so that if I do more larger models, that sort of thing, I can apply it in the same way to get sort of a uniform effect across the whole army. And I was quite happy with the end result, and I'll just try and refine things as we go along. But at the end of the day, we're here again at the end of the video, so thanks everyone for taking the time to watch this. Hopefully it was somewhat entertaining and a bit informative, even though it's not a how-to. In some respects it's a how I did it and how not to, but at the end of the day, thanks for watching, and hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.